The sun hung low and merciless over the town of Redstone, Arizona, its heat pressing down like a judgment on the cracked earth below. Dust swirled in lazy spirals, carried by a dry wind that smelled of sagebrush and despair. I'd ridden into this nowhere place for no reason grander than a fresh horse and a bottle of whiskey, to dull the ache in my bones. My name's Caleb Harrow, a man of 50 winters, with hands calloused from years of rope and rain, and a heart scarred by too many promises broken. Redstone was just another stop on a road that seemed to stretch forever, but that day, something stopped me cold. It was the shouting that drew me first, a coarse chorus of voices rising from the town square. My boots crunched on the gravel as I made my way past sagging storefronts, their paint peeling under the relentless sun. The crowd was packed tight in a dusty clearing between the saloon and a livery stable, their faces a mix of greed, amusement, and something darker. At the center stood a rickety platform, slapped together from splintered planks, and on it, a woman. She was bound by a rope knotted cruelly round her wrists, her dress a faded blue, torn at the shoulder, revealing a tattoo, a coiled design in black ink, like a hawk soaring against the wind. I stopped dead in my tracks. I knew that mark. 5 years back, I'd been a broken man, bleeding out in the sands of the Mojave after a cattle drive gone sour. Bandits had left me for dead, my horse stolen, my water gone. It was a stranger who found me, a man with no name I could pronounce, his face weathered like old leather, his eyes sharp with a quiet wisdom. He bore that same hawk tattoo on his forearm, and without a word, he'd given me water, bandaged my wounds, and set me on my feet. He asked nothing in return, vanishing into the desert like a ghost. That mark had saved my life, and now here it was again, etched on the shoulder of a woman who stood defiant under the gaze of a heartless crowd. Her name, I'd later learn, was Elora. She was tall, her skin sun-kissed, her hair a cascade of chestnut waves that caught the light despite the dust. Her eyes, green as a spring meadow, scanned the crowd with a fire that dared them to meet her gaze. The auctioneer, a weary man with a stained hat, banged a gavel against a post. Starting at $10, he bellowed, his voice nasal and sharp. The crowd snickered, some spitting into the dirt, others muttering she wasn't worth half that. $10 for this wildcat? She'll claw your eyes out, one man jeered, his laugh like a hyena's. Elora's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. I don't know what moved me, maybe the memory of that desert stranger, maybe the injustice of it all, but I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the noise like a blade. 10, I said. The crowd went quiet, heads turning to size me up. I was no stranger to hard stares. My graying beard and weathered duster told a story of a man who'd seen trouble and walked through it. The auctioneer squinted, then shrugged. Sold to the stranger, he called, waving me up. I climbed the platform, my spurs jangling, and handed over the coins. The men holding Elora's ropes smirked as they cut her free, shoving her toward me. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something, surprise, maybe, or recognition, though I couldn't place why. Her wrists were raw where the ropes had bitten, but she held her head high, proud as a queen in a den of thieves. I placed a hand on her arm, gentle but steady, and led her down the steps. The crowd's murmurs followed us like a swarm of flies. Fool's bought himself a curse, one voice hissed. She'll bring him nothing but trouble, another spat. I paid them no mind. We walked out of the square, her steps quick to match my stride, though I could feel her tension, like a coiled spring. The town watched us, their eyes heavy with judgment, but I kept moving until we reached a quiet alley behind the blacksmith's shop. There, I stopped and faced her. You know why I did that? I asked, keeping my voice low. She shook her head, her gaze steady but wary. I tipped my hat back, letting the sun catch my face. Because 5 years ago, a man with that same tattoo saved my life. I reckon he was your kin. Her lips parted, and though her voice was rough from thirst, it carried a strength that matched her eyes. My father, she whispered. You knew him, I nodded. He pulled me from death's door in the desert, gave me water, shelter, and not a word of why. I owe him. She studied me, her expression unreadable, then gave a single nod. His name was Turan, she said softly. I'm Elora. We didn't linger. Redstone wasn't a place for long goodbyes, and the weight of the crowd's stares still clung to us. I led her to the livery where my horse, a sturdy bay named Juniper, waited. Elora followed, her eyes darting to the shadows, her hands still marked red from the ropes. "Where are we going?" she asked as I untied Juniper. "Anywhere but here," I replied, swinging into the saddle and offering her a hand. She hesitated, then took it, climbing up behind me with a grace that belied her ordeal. We rode out of Redstone as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood. The town fell away, replaced by the endless stretch of desert, dotted with yucca and the bones of long-dead cattle. Elora was quiet, her hands gripping the saddle, but I could feel her eyes scanning the horizon, always watching. "You don't have to do this," she said at last, her voice barely audible over the hoof beats. "I know," I said, "but I'm doing it anyway." She shifted slightly, her breath warm against my shoulder. "My father, he was a healer. He never turned anyone away, no matter who they were. That's why they came for us." Her voice hardened, each word sharp as a knife. "Men with guns. They wanted his medicines, his knowledge. He refused to give it to them. So they took us instead, and my sisters, Leela and Mara. I'm the eldest. I fought, broke free, but they caught me again. Not before I saw what they did to him." Her words hung heavy, and I didn't press for more. The desert stretched before us, vast and unyielding, and I knew her story wasn't finished. "You know who they were?" I asked after a long silence. She nodded. "Outlaws. A gang led by a man named Gideon Voss. I'll never forget his face guard, one eye clouded white. There were maybe 15 of them, more at their camp." I let out a low whistle. "That's a tall order for two people." She leaned closer, her voice fierce. "They took my sisters. I'm not leaving them." We rode until the stars burned bright above, stopping only to make camp in a shallow gully where the wind wouldn't carry our fire's smoke. I handed Elora a strip of dried beef and a canteen, and she took them without complaint, though her hands shook slightly. We sat across the fire, the silence thick between us. "You know where they're headed?" I asked. She nodded, her eyes glinting in the firelight. "Blackthorn Canyon, about 2 days' ride west. It's where they take what they steal, people, horses, anything they can sell." I leaned back, staring at the stars. "Then we ride hard tomorrow." She studied me, her expression softening for the first time. "Why are you doing this, Caleb? You don't know me." I met her gaze. "Because your father saved me, and I don't forget a debt. And because no one deserves what they did to you." She didn't reply, but her eyes held mine a moment longer before she looked away, curling into her blanket. As the fire died down, she murmured, almost too soft to hear, "My sisters' names are Leela and Mara." I nodded to the darkness. "Leela and Mara," I repeated. "We'll get them back." The night stretched cold and quiet, but sleep didn't come easy. The weight of her words, her loss, settled into my chest like a stone. I'd come to Redstone for a horse and a drink, but now I was bound to a fight that wasn't mine yet. It was because of a man whose kindness had kept me breathing. Come morning, I'd ride into hell itself if it meant keeping my promise. We broke camp before dawn, the air sharp with frost, the stars fading into a gray sky. Elora moved with a quiet efficiency, her torn dress now tied back to let her ride easier, a single hawk feather tucked into her hair, trembling in the breeze. We spoke little, saving our strength for the road ahead. By the time the sun rose, we were miles from Redstone, the desert unfolding before us like an endless canvas of sand and stone. Elora's knowledge of the land was uncanny. She pointed out signs. I have missed faint hoofprints in the dirt, a broken sagebrush stem, the ashes of an old fire. "They're moving fast," she said as we paused at a set of wagon tracks, her fingers tracing the ruts. "But they're sloppy. Too many men, too many horses." I crouched beside her, squinting at the tracks. "Think they know you escaped?" She stood, brushing dust from her hands. "They know, and they'll be watching for us." We rode through the morning, the heat rising with the sun, pressing down like a heavy hand. By noon, we found clearer signs of the outlaws' passagey deep wheel marks. A scrap of cloth caught on a cactus, a half-eaten biscuit crumbling in the dirt. Elora's eyes narrowed as she studied each one, her focus like a blade. "They're not far ahead," she said. "Maybe a day, if we push hard." I nodded, and we mounted again. Juniper's hooves kicking up dust as we followed the trail. As the day wore on, the landscape grew harsher, the flat desert giving way to jagged ridges and dry washes. A vulture circled high above, its shadow crossing our path like an omen. Elora muttered something under her breath, too low for me to catch. "What was that?" I asked. "A prayer," she said simply, her eyes fixed on the horizon. I didn't press further. By dusk, we crested a low hill and saw at Blackthorn Canyon, a dark gash in the earth, its walls steep and shadowed, swallowing the last light of day. A thin plume of smoke rose from within, faint but unmistakable. Elora's breath caught. "They're there," she said, her voice low and certain. We dismounted, tying Juniper to a scrub pine, and crept closer to the canyon's edge. Voices drifted up, harsh laughter, the clink of bottles, the low whinny of horses. I peered over the rim, my heart steady but heavy. The camp sprawled below, a cluster of tents and wagons circled around a fire. At least a dozen men moved about, their shadows long in the flickering light. Near the fire, two young women sat, their hands bound, their faces pale but defiant. Even from a distance, I could see the resemblance to Elraith's same proud tilt of their chins, the same fire in their posture. "Leela," Elora whispered, her fingers gripping the rock. "Mara." I counted the men. 15, maybe more, most armed with pistols. A few with rifles slung carelessly over their shoulders. A sentry leaned against a boulder near the canyon's entrance, his hat tipped low, a cigarette glowing in his hand. "They're not expecting trouble," I murmured. Elora's eyes burned. "They'll get it." I pulled back, my mind racing. 2 of us against that many? "We go in shooting. We're dead before we reach them." She nodded, her jaw tight. "We wait. We watch. When they sleep, we move." We settled into a shallow crevice above the canyon, the rock cold against our backs. I checked my rifle, counting cartridges, while Elora ran her fingers along the edge of a small knife she'd pulled from her belt. Her lips moved silently, not a prayer this time, but something furchere vow. The stars came out, sharp and cold, and the fire below burned low. I felt the weight of what was coming, not just a debt to her father, but a promise to her sisters, to myself. We'd bring them out of that canyon, or we'd die trying. The night deepened, the air thick with the scent of smoke and sage. The outlaws' voices grew slurred, their laughter fading as they crawled into their bedrolls. The sentry's cigarette went out, his head lolling against the boulder. Elora's eyes never left her sisters, still sitting by the fire, their bound hands resting in their laps. "Soon," she whispered. I nodded, my hand tight on my rifle. The desert held its breath, and so did we. Meanwhile, the night clung to Blackthorn Canyon like a shroud, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and the faint tang of blood. Caleb, Harrow, and Elora crouched on the ledge above the outlaws' camp, their breaths shallow, their eyes fixed on the flickering fire below. The 2 sisters, Leela and Mara, sat bound near the flames, their faces pale but unyielding, mirroring Elora's defiant spirit. The outlaws, a ragged band of 15 men led by the scarred Gideon Voss, sprawled in their bedrolls, their snores mingling with the crackle of the dying fire. The sentry, slouched against a boulder, was no longer a threat. His cigarette had gone out, his head lolling in drunken sleep. Caleb's hand tightened on his rifle, the weight of their plan settling like lead in his chest. They had one chance to free the sisters, and the odds were stacked against them. Elora's knife glinted faintly as she shifted beside him, her eyes never leaving her sister's. "We move now," she whispered, her voice steady but fierce, like a blade honed by grief. Caleb nodded, his heart pounding a rhythm that matched the desert's pulse. They'd agreed to wait until the camp was quiet, slipping in under cover of darkness to cut Leela and Mara free. But the canyon's walls loomed like silent judges, and every shadow seemed to hide another threat. Caleb had seen his share of fights, bar brawls, cattle rustler ambushes, even a duel at dawn, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival. It was about a debt, a promise, and the kind of justice that left scars deeper than any bullet. They descended a narrow goat trail, moving like ghosts, their boots silent on the sandy rock. The canyon swallowed them in darkness, the stars above offering little light. When they reached the sentry, Elora moved first, her knife flashing across his throat before he could stir. She caught him as he slumped, easing him to the ground with a gentleness that belied the act. Caleb's stomach twisted, but he said nothing. This was her fight as much as his, and her father's blood demanded it. They crept toward the camp, staying low, the fire's glow casting long shadows that danced across the wagons. The sisters were tied to a post a few feet from the sleeping outlaws, close enough to reach but far enough to give them a sliver of hope. Caleb's eyes scanned the camp. 15 men, maybe 16, their pistols tucked close, rifles leaning against crates. The air was thick with the stench of whiskey and unwashed bodies. He motioned to Elora, and they edged forward, each step measured, each breath held. Lila's eyes snapped open as they approached, her gaze locking onto Elora's. Recognition flared, followed by a flicker of fear. Elora pressed a finger to her lips, her knife slicing through the ropes with a single, practiced motion. Mara stirred, her younger face drawn but resolute, and Elora freed her too, hushing her soft sob with a touch. Caleb gestured toward the rocks, urging them to move. The sisters clung to each other, their bare feet stumbling on the uneven ground, but they followed, silent as shadows. They were nearly to the trail when a bottle clinked against a stone. Caleb froze, his heart lurching. An outlaw had rolled over in his sleep, his hand knocking the bottle loose. His eyes fluttered open, bleary and unfocused, catching the faint movement of their retreat. "Hey," he started, his voice thick with drink. Caleb's knife was out before the word finished, sinking into the man's chest. He caught the body as it fell, lowering it silently, but the damage was done. Another outlaw stirred, then another, their voices rising in confusion. "Who's there?" one shouted, scrambling for his gun. "Run," Caleb hissed, shoving Lila ahead. Elora grabbed Mara, pulling her toward the trail as shouts erupted behind them. Gunshots cracked through the night, bullets sparking off the canyon walls. Caleb fired back, his rifle's report echoing like thunder. One outlaw fell, clutching his chest, but more were rising, their silhouettes dark against the firelight. Elora's knife flashed as a man lunged from the shadows. His scream cut short as she drove the blade into his side. The sisters stumbled up the steep trail, rocks sliding under their feet, their breaths ragged with panic. Caleb covered their retreat, dropping to one knee behind a boulder. The canyon's narrow path worked in their favor, funneling the outlaws into a choke point. He fired again, the lead man tumbling back into his comrades, buying them precious seconds. "Go," he shouted, and Elora hauled her sisters upward, their skirts catching on jagged stone. Caleb's rifle clicked empty, and he slung it over his shoulder, sprinting after them. The outlaws' curses followed, their bullets whining past, kicking up dust. They reached the ridge where Juniper waited, the horse snorting nervously at the gunfire. Elora boosted Mara into the saddle, then Lila, her movements swift despite the chaos. Caleb mounted last, pulling Elora up behind him. They spurred Juniper into a gallop, the desert blurring beneath them as they fled. Bullets chased them, but the darkness swallowed their trail, and the canyon's echoes faded. They rode hard, the wind biting their faces, until the moon hung high and the gunfire was a distant memory. When they finally slowed, the horses lathered and trembling, Caleb glanced back. The ridge was empty, the outlaws either dead or too far behind. Lila and Mara clung to each other, their sobs quiet but raw. Elora sat stiffly behind Caleb, her hands gripping the saddle, her eyes fixed on the black horizon. "We made it," Caleb said, his voice rough with dust and relief. Elora shook her head, her voice low. "Not yet. They'll come for us. Gideon Voss doesn't let debts go unpaid." They made camp in a dry wash, hidden by a cluster of boulders. The sisters collapsed together, their arms wrapped tight around each other, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. Caleb handed out what little food he had, hardtack and a few strips of jerky, while Elora kept watch, her knife never far from her hand. The fire was small, barely enough to warm their hands, but it was all they dared. "You kept your promise," Caleb said, meeting Elora's gaze across the flames. She shook her head again, her eyes fierce. "Not until they're all safe. Not until Voss pays for my father." Caleb nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He'd bought her freedom in Redstone, but this was no longer just about a debt to her father, Turan. It was about Lila and Mara, about the blood spilled in that canyon. and about a man with a scarred face and a clouded eye who'd burned a family's world to ash. You know where they'll go next? He asked. Alora's lips tightened. They'll head to Devil's Hollow, a day's ride south. It's where they regroup, where Voss plans his next move. If we're quick, we can catch them before they dig in. The sisters slept fitfully, their breathing uneven, while Caleb and Alora took turns keeping watch. The desert was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that hid danger, like a rattlesnake coiled in the shadows. Caleb's mind turned over the fight in the canyon's blood, the gunfire, the sisters' terrified eyes. He'd killed before, but each time left a mark, a weight that never quite lifted. Alora, though, seemed carved from stone, her grief and rage forging her into something unbreakable. He wondered what it cost her, carrying that fire inside. Dawn broke cold and gray, the sky streaked with clouds like bruises. They packed camp quickly, the sisters moving with a quiet determination that mirrored Alora's. Leela, the elder of the two, was 16, her eyes sharp and wary, while Mara, barely 14, clung to her sister's hand, her face pale but resolute. "We're going after them?" Leela asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Alora nodded. "We end this." Caleb met her gaze, seeing the same resolve he'd felt in the desert 5 years ago, when Turan's kindness had pulled him back from death. They rode south, following a faint trail of hoofprints and broken brush. Alora's knowledge of the land guided them, her eyes catching signs Caleb essayed a scuff in the dirt. A snapped twig, the faint scent of smoke on the wind. By midday, they found fresh tracks, deep ruts from wagons, the marks of a dozen horses. "They're moving slower now," Alora said, crouching to study the ground. "They're angry, careless. That's our chance." Caleb nodded, but his gut twisted. Anger made men dangerous, and Voss's gang was already a nest of vipers. The landscape grew harsher as they neared Devil's Hollow, the flat desert giving way to rocky outcrops and dry riverbeds. A hawk circled above, its cry sharp in the still air. Alora glanced up, her lips moving silently, a prayer, maybe, or another vow. Caleb didn't ask. They paused only once, to water the horses at a trickle of a spring, and Alora shared what little she knew of Voss. "He's a ghost in these parts," she said, her voice low. "Raids villages, takes what he wants, people, goods, lives. No one's stopped him, because no one's lived long enough to try." They reached Devil's Hollow by late afternoon, the sun low and blood red. The hollow was a narrow cut in the earth, its walls steep and jagged, a natural fortress that funneled travelers into a deadly trap. Caleb dismounted, leading Juniper to a sheltered spot behind a cluster of rocks. The sisters followed, their steps quiet but tense. Alora pointed to a faint wisp of smoke rising from the hollow's depths. "They're here," she said, her voice a blade's edge. Caleb peered over the ridge, counting figurescent men, maybe 12, their horses tied near a cluster of tents. Voss's scarred face was unmistakable, even from a distance, his white eye glinting in the fading light. "We can't take them head-on," Caleb said, his voice low. "Too many, too well-armed." Alora nodded, her eyes scanning the hollow. "We wait for dark, pick them off one by one." Lila's voice broke the silence, soft but firm. "What if they see us first?" Caleb met her gaze, seeing the fear she tried to hide. "Then we fight," he said simply. Mara's hand tightened on Lila's, but she said nothing, her young face set with a courage that made Caleb's chest ache. They settled into position, hidden among the rocks, and waited as the sun sank below the horizon. The outlaws' voices carried up louder, curses, the clink of bottles. Caleb checked his rifle, counting cartridges, each one a prayer for survival. Alora sharpened her knife, her movements precise, her expression unreadable. The sisters sat close, their hands clasped, their eyes fixed on the camp below. The air grew heavy with anticipation, the kind that made every sound too loud, every shadow too deep. As darkness fell, the camp quieted, the outlaws settling into their bedrolls. Caleb and Alora exchanged a look, a silent agreement that the time was near. They'd slip into the hollow, free any captives, and deal with Voss's men as they slept. But the plan hinged on stealth, and Caleb knew one wrong move could turn the hollow into a slaughterhouse. He thought of Turan, of the hawk tattoo, of the debt that had brought him here. This wasn't just about saving the sisters anymore. It was about ending a cycle of blood and greed, about making sure no other family suffered as Alora's had. The stars were bright now, their light cold and unforgiving. Caleb's hand rested on his rifle, his heart steady but heavy. Alora's eyes met his, and for a moment, he saw the weight she carried, grief, rage, and a flicker of hope. "For Leela and Mara," she whispered. "For my father," Caleb nodded. "For all of them." And with that, they moved, slipping into the shadows of Devil's Hollow, ready to face whatever hell waited below. Finally, the darkness of Devil's Hollow swallowed Caleb, Harrow, and Alora as they descended, their steps silent on the rocky trail. The outlaws' camp lay below, a faint glow from the dying fire casting shadows across the tents and wagons. Leela and Mara waited hidden in a shallow cave above, their faces pale but resolute, their hands clasped tightly. Caleb's rifle was a familiar weight in his hands, but the stakes felt heavier than ever. This wasn't just a rescue now, it was a reckoning. Gideon Voss and his gang had taken to muck lives, families, hope, and tonight, Caleb and Alora meant to end it. The hollow was a trap by nature, its steep walls funneling any approach into a narrow path where one wrong step could mean death. The outlaws, 10 or 12 strong, were careless in their confidence, their snores mingling with the rustle of desert wind. Voss's scarred face had been burned into Caleb's mind from Alora's description, a man with a clouded white eye, a jagged scar running from brow to jaw, and a cruelty that left villages in ashes. Caleb had faced men like him before, but none with a reputation as black as Voss's. Alora, crouched beside him, gripped her knife, her eyes fierce with a purpose that needed no words. They moved like shadows, hugging the canyon walls, their breaths shallow to avoid stirring the dust. The fire's glow revealed Dicentrison near the camp's edge, leaning on a rifle, the other pacing lazily by the horses. Caleb pointed to the first, and Alora nodded, slipping into the darkness. He watched her move, silent and swift, her knife catching the starlight as she reached the sentry. A quick flash, a muffled gasp, and the man slumped to the ground. Caleb took the second, creeping close and striking with the butt of his rifle, dropping him without a sound. They dragged the bodies into the shadows, their hearts pounding, but their hands steady. The camp was quiet now, the outlaws sprawled in their bedrolls, their weapons within reach but unguarded. Caleb and Alora crept toward the center, where a single figure sat tied to a post, a young boy, no older than 12, his face bruised, his eyes wide with fear. Alora's breath caught, but she kept moving, cutting his ropes with a single stroke. The boy flinched, then relaxed as he saw her face. "You're not one of them," he whispered. She shook her head, pressing a finger to her lips, and pointed to the trail. Caleb guided him toward the rocks, his eyes scanning the camp for any sign of movement. They were halfway back when a shout split the night. An outlaw sat up, his eyes bleary but sharpening as he spotted them. "Intruders," he bellowed, scrambling for his pistol. Caleb fired first, the shot echoing through the hollow, dropping the man before he could aim. But the camp erupted, outlaws rolling from their blankets, grabbing weapons, their curses filling the air. Alora shoved the boy toward the trail, shouting, "Run," as she turned to face the onslaught. Caleb dropped behind a crate, his rifle barking as he took down two men charging toward them. Bullets whined past, splintering wood and sparking off stone. Alora moved like a wraith, her knife flashing as she cut down an outlaw who lunged at her, his pistol falling uselessly to the dirt. The boy scrambled up the trail, his small frame disappearing into the shadows. Caleb fired again, each shot deliberate, each body that fell buying them time. But the outlaws were closing in, their numbers overwhelming, their shouts growing louder. "Voss," Alora's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. A figure stepped into the firelight, broad, his scarred face twisted in a sneer, his white eye glinting like a dead star. Gideon Voss held a revolver in each hand, his stance calm but deadly. "You must be the sister," he said, his voice low and mocking. "Come to die with your kin." Alora's knife gleamed as she stepped forward, her eyes burning. "You killed my father. You took my sisters. This ends tonight." Voss laughed, a sound like gravel underfoot. "You and this old man? You're nothing." Caleb fired, but Voss was faster. diving behind a wagon as the bullet grazed his arm. The outlaws rallied, their gunfire pinning Caleb and Elora behind a boulder. The air was thick with dust and gunpowder, the hollow a crucible of noise and death. Caleb's cartridges were running low, and he knew they couldn't hold out much longer. "We need to draw them out," he muttered. Elora nodded, her eyes scanning the terrain. The narrow pass forced them into it. They moved, ducking low as bullets tore through the air. Caleb fired to keep the outlaws at bay, while Elora led the way to the choke point where the hollow's walls squeezed tight. They reached it just as Voss's men surged forward, their shouts echoing off the stone. Caleb took position behind a rock, his rifle steady, and fired into the advancing line. One man fell, then another, their bodies clogging the path, slowing the others. Elora darted out, her knife finding a third man before he could raise his gun. Voss's voice roared over the chaos. "Enough!" He stepped into the open, his revolvers blazing. Caleb ducked as a bullet grazed his shoulder, the pain sharp but fleeting. Elora lunged at Voss, her knife aimed for his chest, but he sidestepped, grabbing her wrist and twisting hard. She gasped, the knife falling, but she drove her knee into his side, breaking free. Caleb fired, clipping Voss's leg, and the outlaw stumbled, cursing. The fight became a blur of shots, shouts, the clash of steel and flesh. Caleb's rifle clicked empty, and he drew his revolver, dropping another outlaw as he charged. Elora fought with a ferocity that chilled him, her hands a whirlwind of motion, her knife reclaimed and dripping red. The remaining outlaws faltered, their numbers dwindling, their confidence shaken by the sight of their leader limping. Caleb saw his chance and tackled Voss, pinning him to the ground. The outlaw's white eye glared up, filled with hate, but Caleb's fists silenced him. Each blow a reckoning for Turan, for the sisters, for every life Voss had broken. When the last outlaw fell, the hollow was silent, the air heavy with the stench of blood and smoke. Caleb stood, his chest heaving, his shoulder burning. Elora leaned against a rock, her knife slick, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. Voss lay unconscious, his hands bound with his own belt. The boy they'd freed emerged from the shadows, his eyes wide but grateful. "You saved me," he whispered. Elora nodded, her voice soft. "Go find Leela and Mara. They're up the trail." They climbed back to the cave, where the sisters waited, their faces lighting up as they saw Elora. Leela threw her arms around her, Mara clinging to her side, their tears mingling with dust. The boy, whose name was Sam, joined them, his small frame trembling but alive. Caleb stood back, giving them space, his eyes on the horizon. The fight was over, but the cost was heavy blood on their hands, scars on their souls. They rode north at dawn, Voss tied across a horse, his men left to the desert's mercy. The sisters rode close, their silence speaking louder than words. Elora's hawk feather danced in the wind, a reminder of the father they'd lost and the fight they'd won. Caleb's shoulder ached, but he ignored it, his mind on the village ahead, a place he'd never seen, but felt bound to by Turan's memory. By midday, the desert gave way to greener land, the air cooler, the ground softer with grass. The village appeared in a valley below, its huts clustered along a sparkling river. Smoke rose lazily, and figures moved in the distance, children, women, men with spears. Elora stopped, her eyes glistening as she looked down. "Home," she whispered. Caleb dismounted, his boots sinking into the earth. "You want me to ride in with you?" he asked. She shook her head, a faint smile breaking through. "You've done enough, Caleb. More than enough." They walked the final stretch, the village stirring as they approached. An elder stepped forward, his face lined with years, his eyes sharp with recognition. He looked at the sisters, then at Sam, then at Caleb, his gaze lingering on the bound Voss. Elora spoke, her voice steady. "They're safe. The men who took them are gone." The elder nodded, his words in a tongue Caleb didn't know. But Elora translated. "He says the debt is paid." The village enveloped the sisters, hands touching their faces, voices offering comfort. Voss was taken away, his fate left to the elder's judgment. Elora turned to Caleb, her eyes holding his. "You'll go now?" she asked. He nodded, tipping his hat. "You'll be all right," he said, not a question but a hope. She smiled, small but real. "I've got them now. As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. "Caleb," he looked back. "Thank you," she said, her words simple but heavy. He gave a nod, the smallest of smiles. "No need for thanks. Not for this." Caleb rode out alone, the village fading behind him, the sisters' silhouettes sharp against the morning light. The desert stretched ahead, endless but no longer empty. The debt to Turan was paid, but more than that, he'd given Elora her family back, and in doing so, found a piece of himself he'd thought long lost. As the wind carried him west, he felt lighter, the hawk tattoo a memory not of debt, but of mercy. So ends the tale of Caleb Harrow and the Sisters of the Hawk, a story of blood, vengeance, and redemption carved into the American West. From a dusty auction in Redstone to the deadly hollows of the desert, Caleb honored a debt to a man who saved him, bringing 3 sisters home and ending a tyrant's reign. The feather in Elora's hair, the fire in her eyes, were thanks enough. And as the sun rose, painting the desert gold, his shadow rode on, carrying the promise of a new dawn. What do you think of Caleb and Elora's choices? Was their fight against Voss justified, or does violence only breed more injustice? Should they have spared Voss for the law, or was their vengeance the only path? Share your thoughts in the comments. Bilal would love to hear your stand on this tale of blood and honor.